A brutal winter storm swallowed the city as an accused Navy SEAL and his German Shepherd drove along the frozen rail line. He was already fighting the law, one mistake away from losing everything. Then his dog stopped, alerting to a derailed train hidden in the blinding snow. Inside the twisted steel, a woman was trapped and freezing. Saving her meant breaking the rules that kept him free. Walking away would have saved his future. He chose neither comfort nor safety. He chose honor. What he didn't know was this: the woman he pulled from the wreck would soon stand in court as the judge who held his fate in her hands. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from. And if stories of loyalty, courage, and second chances move you, please subscribe for more. Spokane, Washington wore winter-like armor. The city sat in a pale basin of light, the kind that made the snow look clean and almost merciful, until the wind moved and reminded every living thing that mercy was not on the schedule. Morning came bright anyway, sunlight bouncing off rooftops, off iced-over sidewalks, off the Spokane River where the current still bullied its way through slush and broken plates of gray ice. The air tasted of metal and pine resin and car exhaust that couldn't quite rise because the cold pressed it down. Street signs creaked on their poles, power lines hummed like tired violins. Even the distant hills looked sharpened, as if the season had filed the whole world into something harder and less forgiving. People in Spokane knew winter. They salted steps, drove slow, kept extra blankets. But that morning carried a particular edge, quiet in a way that didn't feel peaceful, quiet like a held breath before something decides to break. North of town, beyond the familiar grid of coffee shops and small brick buildings, the freight corridor cut through industrial lots and sparse stands of ponderosa pine. The tracks ran straight and confident for miles, a dark seam stitched into a white landscape, and the wind slid along them, as if the steel were a channel for bad news. Near those rails, tucked in a modest cabin set back from the road behind a line of snow-buried shrubs, Ethan Walker lived like a man trying to be smaller than his own history. He was 35, tall, around 6'1", with the compact, disciplined build of someone who had spent years making his body a tool, and then had to learn, painfully, that a tool can still ache. His face had the angular geometry of a career spent under harsh suns and harsher decisions, a square jaw, cheekbones that looked carved rather than grown, and a scar that nicked one eyebrow as if someone had once tried to erase his expression and failed. He kept his hair clipped short, dark brown with a touch of winter at the temples that did not match his age so much as it matched his memories. His beard, when he let it come in, was a neat stubble. Never the scruffy kind, never the "I've given up" kind, because even when Ethan tried to disappear, discipline followed him like a shadow he couldn't outrun. He wore the same thing most days, as if uniforms were safer than choices. A U.S. Navy working uniform in green camouflage, the fabric worn into soft creases at the elbows and knees, practical boots laced tight, the whole look saying he belonged to order even when his life did not. The neighbors saw him sometimes, at the small grocery, at the gas station, at the post office, moving with a quiet caution, polite without inviting conversation, eyes scanning in a way that suggested he always knew where exits were. To strangers, he seemed calm, maybe aloof. To anyone who looked closer, his calm was a fence, not a field. It had been built after the war, after the loss, after the night he learned that surviving an explosion doesn't end when the smoke clears. It ends when the ringing in your bones finally stops telling you you're still there. Some nights, it didn't stop. Some nights it came back like a prankster god tapping the same wound just to see if it still hurt. Ethan's mornings began early, before his thoughts could gather into sharp shapes. He brewed coffee the old way, black and bitter enough to argue with the cold. He checked the stove, checked the locks, checked the phone on the wall as if the phone were a thin rope tied to a cliff. That phone mattered now, not because of friends or family, those had fallen away like leaves in a different season, but because it was part of a system that claimed to keep him accountable. 2 weeks earlier, after an accusation at the rail maintenance yard, a judge had allowed him conditional release. He could work, he could come home, he could sleep in his own bed, but he had to answer a call when it came and be exactly where he said he would be. A curfew, a leash made of policy instead of leather. Ethan had signed papers, listened to warnings, nodded to people who spoke about him as if he were a file cabinet. He understood rules. Rules were easy. The hard part was living as a man who had been trained to act decisively, now ordered to do nothing impulsive, nothing heroic, nothing that made other people nervous. The irony wasn't funny. It was the kind of cosmic joke that left bruises. At the rail company, the work itself was straightforward. Fix what's broken, replace what's unsafe. But the accusation hanging over him made every wrench feel heavier. Someone had claimed high-value equipment disappeared on a day Ethan signed off on a shipment. Ethan insisted it was a setup, that a line item had been buried, that paper could be weaponized as easily as steel. The authorities heard him the way winter hears a plea, without warmth. So now he lived quietly, worked quietly, and tried to keep his life small enough that nobody could blame him for the shape of it. He might have succeeded too, if not for the dog. Shadow was a German shepherd, 7 years old, a service dog trained with the seriousness of a fellow soldier. His coat was classic black and tan, but with a slightly lighter saddle, the fur along his shoulders thick and weatherproof, built for cold like a second uniform. He was big, 80 pounds of muscle and intelligence, and he moved with that particular shepherd grace that looked like constant calculation. His ears were tall, one with a slight notch near the tip as if some past had tried to mark him. His eyes were amber, alert and unsettlingly expressive, as if he could read the weather inside a human chest. Shadow had a calm that wasn't lazy. It was purposeful, like a guard tower that never slept. Around strangers, he kept his distance, watched hands, watched tone. Around Ethan, he became something softer but no less vigilant, the anchor to the present, the warm weight that pressed against Ethan's leg when the memories tried to drag him backward. Ethan didn't speak much, but he spoke to Shadow, not in baby talk, not in theatrics, but in the low, steady voice of a man who trusted his dog more than he trusted his own mind. "Good morning, buddy," he'd say, and Shadow would answer with a slow wag and a lean, a wordless reminder that the world still contained one reliable thing. That morning, after coffee, Ethan clipped Shadow's vest on, simple, practical, with a handle and patches that read "Service Dog," and opened the door. The cold hit like a slap that had been waiting all night. Snow lay in clean drifts and crusty ridges, glittering under a bright sky that looked too innocent for the bite in the wind. The sun was up, but it offered no heat, only exposure. Ethan stepped out in his NWU, the camouflage oddly fitting against the winter pines, and pulled his collar higher. Shadow trotted beside him, paws crunching softly, breath puffing in white bursts. They moved along the edge of the property where the trees thinned and the rail corridor opened, a wide strip of snow and gravel and steel. Ethan didn't go onto the tracks. He wasn't reckless. He also wasn't stupid. He knew how quickly reckless could be stamped onto a man's file, but he liked to look at the rails. They were honest in their own way. A train came when it came. It didn't gossip. It didn't pretend. It didn't care who you had been. It just moved. The wind carried the faint smell of creosote and cold iron. Far off, a horn sounded, distant, routine. Shadow's ears flicked, but he stayed loose, alert without alarm. Ethan watched the line where the tracks disappeared into a stand of trees. Everything looked normal. The pale sky, the bright snow, the long, dark steel. The kind of normal that can lull a person into believing the day will behave. Ethan felt, for a moment, almost steady. His shoulders unclenched. He let his breath out. Then Shadow stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. His entire body stiffened as if a switch had been thrown. His head lifted, nose testing the air. The fur along his spine rose, not in aggression, but in warning, the way it had risen in other places, other years, when danger was a smell before it was a sight. A low rumble formed in his chest, quiet but unmistakable. Ethan's hand tightened on the leash without realizing it. "What is it?" he asked softly, eyes sweeping the rail line, the trees, the snowbanks, the empty service road. Shadow did not look at Ethan for permission. He stared toward the tracks, ears angled forward, every sense locked onto something that didn't belong. Ethan followed the dog's gaze and saw nothing. No people, no vehicles, no obvious movement, just brightness and wind and a world pretending to be still. That was the unsettling part, the way the landscape seemed staged, too clean, too bright, like a postcard hiding a knife behind it. Shadow's rumble deepened. And Ethan felt the familiar prickle at the base of his skull, the instinct that had once kept him alive and now mostly kept him lonely. He took a step closer to the corridor, careful, scanning. The wind shifted, and then it came, a sound that cut through the bright morning like a blade drawn slow from a sheath, a long, high metallic screech, distant but rising, the terrible voice of steel scraping steel, not the normal rhythm of a passing train, but an angry, sustained cry, the kind of noise that meant something heavy was losing an argument with physics. Shadow's growl stopped. He went utterly silent, as if silence were the only respectful response to that scream. Ethan's stomach dropped with a cold certainty he couldn't name yet, only recognize. The rails ahead, still invisible beyond the trees, had become the mouth of a story that did not care about curfews, paperwork, or the fragile little order Ethan had built. He stood in the snow, NWU stark against the white, one hand on the leash, the other hovering near his pocket where his phone would later demand obedience, and he listened as the metal shriek stretched on, too long, too wrong, like the world itself was sliding off its tracks. The sound carried farther than Ethan expected, a long, metallic scream that scraped along the frozen air and seemed to bend the daylight itself. And by the time he reached the chain-link fence that marked the boundary of the rail corridor, the noise had resolved into something worse than imagination, the uneven, stuttering groan of steel under stress. Snow reflected the morning sun so brightly it hurt the eyes, turning the open stretch beyond the fence into a white stage where every dark shape stood exposed. Ethan vaulted the fence without thinking, boots biting into crusted snow, his body slipping easily back into a rhythm it remembered even when his mind tried to forget. Shadow cleared the fence a heartbeat later, landing silently, shoulders rolling forward as he moved, nose low, tail level, the posture of a working dog who had just found the center of the problem. The tracks curved ahead through a shallow cut in the land, and there, half swallowed by drifting snow and glaring sunlight, sat a freight train that had no business being stopped there. Several cars remained upright and obedient, lined up like soldiers who hadn't yet realized the order had failed, but farther back the formation broke. One car had jumped the rail at the curve, its steel wheels perched at a wrong angle, another jackknifed behind it, the couplers twisted and strained like broken wrists. The engine, mercifully, was farther ahead and still, its presence a distant authority that could do nothing now. The air smelled sharp, metallic, laced with the acrid tang of friction-heated steel cooling too fast. Ethan slowed, heart hammering in a way that felt both familiar and unwelcome, scanning for movement, for sparks, for the telltale haze of leaking fuel. He saw none, but the silence between groans was not empty. It was loaded, waiting. Shadow paused, lifted his head, and gave a short, focused bark, not alarm, not fear, but signal. Ethan followed the dog's line of sight to the rear section of the damaged cars, where one boxcar sat canted toward the embankment, its side scraped raw, its sliding door partially open as if the train itself had tried to scream and failed. "Easy," Ethan murmured, more to himself than the dog, and moved closer, keeping his weight low, steps deliberate. As he approached, the groaning intensified, a slow, rhythmic complaint that matched the wind pushing at the train's flank. He reached the boxcar and leaned in, eyes adjusting to the dim interior where daylight spilled in through torn seams and a fractured door. At first he saw only shadow and ice-rimmed metal. Then he saw her. She lay near the far wall, crumpled against a stack of cargo crates, her body angled awkwardly, one arm trapped beneath her, the other slack at her side. She was a woman in her early 40s, maybe mid-40s, tall and lean, even folded the wrong way, with long dark hair pulled into a low ponytail that had come loose, strands plastered to her pale cheek by melting snow. Her skin was a winter gray, lips tinged blue, eyelashes frosted white. She wore a heavy wool coat the color of wet charcoal, tailored rather than bulky, the kind someone chose because it looked professional, even when it had to work hard. And beneath it, a glimpse of a cream-colored sweater that looked far too clean for the violence of the wreck. Her boots were sensible leather, scuffed but cared for, and the fingers of her gloved hand twitched once, barely, like a signal sent from very far away. Ethan's training took over, pushing thought aside. Alive, he registered. Hypothermic, likely concussed, alone. Shadow stepped into the boxcar without waiting for permission, careful paws navigating debris, his breath audible now, a steady huff-huff that seemed to warm the air simply by existing. He approached the woman and stopped, looking back at Ethan once, amber eyes sharp with question and trust. Ethan nodded. "Good," he said softly. "Stay." Shadow lowered himself beside the woman, pressed his shoulder gently against her torso, careful not to jostle her, and leaned in. The heat of his body an immediate, practical miracle in a space that smelled like cold iron and fear. The woman made a small sound then, a breath dragged out of her by reflex rather than will, and her brow furrowed as if she were arguing with sleep. Ethan moved closer, knelt, and checked her airway, his gloved fingers light and precise. Her pulse was thready, but there, fluttering under his touch like a trapped bird. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, controlled, the way he'd learned kept panic from blooming. "Can you hear me?" There was no response, but the twitching stopped, replaced by a deeper stillness that worried him more. He glanced back over his shoulder toward the open corridor. No sirens yet. No voices, just wind and the tortured breathing of a train that wanted to finish falling. Ethan checked his watch without meaning to, the habit ingrained and cruel. The minute hand was already edging too close to the time he was supposed to be home, supposed to be within reach of that phone on the wall. If he left now, if he walked back the way he came and pretended he'd seen nothing but snow and sunlight, the system would stay quiet. He could make coffee, wait for the call, answer like a compliant citizen, and sleep in his own bed. He could keep Shadow. He could keep the fragile, hard-won normal that had taken years to build and only minutes to lose. The thought made his chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with cold. Shadow lifted his head then and looked at him, really looked, eyes dark and steady. The same look he'd given Ethan in other places, other times, when the math had been ugly and the answer had still been clear. It wasn't accusation. It wasn't pleading. It was recognition. "This is who you are," the look said. "This is the job." Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the air burn his lungs. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, not to call for help yet, not to do anything useful, but to feel its weight, to remind himself of the leash he was considering cutting. The screen lit briefly, a pale square against the dark interior of the boxcar, and he shut it off again without unlocking it, as if even the glow were an accusation. "All right," he murmured, more to Shadow than to himself. "All right." He shrugged out of his jacket and draped it over the woman's torso, tucking it in around her shoulders to trap what heat there was. He checked the stability of the crates, the angle of the car, the way the wind pushed against the open door. The train shifted, just a fraction, metal complaining loudly, and Ethan froze until it settled again. Time stretched thin. Somewhere, far down the line, he thought he heard a horn, faint and unsure, the sound of someone finally realizing something was wrong. He pressed 2 fingers to the woman's neck again, counted, adjusted Shadow's position with a gentle touch so the dog's weight provided warmth without pressure. The woman's face, now closer, held a sternness even in unconsciousness, the lines at her mouth and eyes suggesting a life lived in rooms where decisions mattered, where people listened when she spoke. There was a faint cut at her hairline, blood dried dark against pale skin, and Ethan felt a flicker of anger at the randomness of it all, at the way a day that had begun bright and ordinary had turned into this. He didn't know her name. He didn't know why she was in a boxcar instead of a passenger seat. He didn't know who would come looking or when. He only knew that if he walked away, the quiet would swallow her whole. Outside, the wind picked up, snow hissing against steel, the sound almost like whispered urging. Ethan rose to his feet, boots sinking into drifted snow inside the car, and looked back once more toward the path that led home. The way back was clear, the fence waiting, the sunlight generous and forgiving. Shadow watched him, unmoving, the woman's breath shallow against his fur. Ethan turned away from the fence and stepped deeper into the snow, closer to the wounded train, closer to the choice he had already made even before he admitted it to himself. And as he did, the metal groan rose again, louder this time, a warning that patience was running out. The boxcar groaned again, a low, arthritic complaint that traveled through steel and bone alike. and Ethan felt it through the soles of his boots as he shifted his weight and climbed higher along the skewed side of the damaged car. Snow poured steadily now, thick flakes tumbling through bright daylight, coating everything in a false softness that hid edges and angles, and he moved with the careful economy of someone who had learned the hard way that haste was not the same as speed. The old SEAL instincts returned without ceremony, not as bravado, but as procedure. 3 points of contact, test before trusting, never assume the ground will hold simply because it did a second ago. His gloved hands found purchase on cold rivets and scarred metal as he worked his way toward the undercarriage where the car's hardware was exposed, Shadow pacing below with a watchful patience that looked like stillness, until it didn't. From this angle, the damage revealed itself in layers, the way truth often did. The wheels had jumped the rail, yes, but the real story sat farther up the line where the brake rigging should have told a different tale. Ethan crouched, breath fogging the air, and examined the linkage with a practiced eye. The handbrake wheel was not where it should be, and the brake shoes bore uneven wear that spoke of force applied at the wrong moment in the wrong way. More troubling still were the tool marks, fresh, careless scratches on a component that should have been factory smooth, the kind left by someone in a hurry or someone confident no one would look closely. He traced the marks with a fingertip and felt anger bloom cold and clean inside him. This wasn't weather, this wasn't chance. Someone had interfered, and they had done it with the expectation that gravity and momentum would finish the job. Ethan straightened slowly, scanning the length of the train again, the bright snow erasing footprints almost as soon as they formed, and wondered how many decisions had been made somewhere warm that ended here in a screaming curve of steel. Below him, inside the boxcar, the woman stirred. Her breath hitched and then broke into a ragged inhale that sounded like a swimmer coming up too fast. Ethan slid back down, boots scraping, and dropped to a knee beside her as Shadow shifted to make room. Up close, she looked older than he'd thought, early 40s perhaps, but there was a contained strength in the set of her shoulders and the tension in her jaw that suggested a life spent carrying responsibility rather than avoiding it. Her face was long and angular, with high cheekbones and a straight nose now reddened by cold, and her skin, pale from shock and winter light, bore the fine lines of someone who frowned thoughtfully more often than she smiled easily. Her hair, a deep brown threaded with the faintest hint of silver at the temples, had slipped free of its tie and clung damply to her forehead near the shallow cut. And when her eyes fluttered open, they were dark and sharp even through confusion, the gaze of someone accustomed to assessing a room before deciding how to move through it. She tried to push herself up, panic lending her strength without sense, and the boxcar answered with a dangerous creak. "Don't," Ethan said firmly, his voice cutting through the noise with authority that didn't require volume. "Stay still." She froze, chest heaving, pupils blown wide as the reality of the space pressed in. Steel walls, the yawning doorway, the blinding snow beyond. Her breathing sped, short and shallow, the beginnings of a spiral Ethan recognized all too well. Shadow stepped in closer at Ethan's nod, his broad chest warm against her side, and then, with a deliberateness born of training, he placed his head across her sternum, applying steady pressure. The effect was immediate and almost miraculous. Her breath stuttered once, then slowed as if compelled to match the dog's deep rhythmic exhale. Ethan watched the color creep back into her lips by degrees, watched her hands unclench where they had fisted the fabric of her coat. "You're safe," he told her, choosing the words carefully because words mattered when the body didn't believe them yet. "I've got you. He's got you." Her eyes found his then, tracking the lines of his face as if cataloging facts to anchor herself, the squared jaw dusted with frost, the steady calm that felt earned rather than assumed, the uniform that spoke of order in a place that had lost it. What happened?" she managed, her voice hoarse, each syllable brittle with cold. "The train," Ethan said. "It jumped the rail. You hit your head. You've been cold." He glanced at the open door and the snow pouring in, then back at her. "Can you tell me your name?" She swallowed, the motion careful. "Sarah," she said after a moment, as if confirming it to herself first. "Sarah Miller." The name fit her, plain, solid, unadorned, and Ethan nodded. "I'm Ethan," he replied, not adding more than that. Titles complicated things. Sarah tried to sit again, a reflex driven by dignity as much as fear, and winced as pain lanced through her shoulder. Ethan held up a hand. Easy. This car, is unstable. He hesitated, then corrected himself. This boxcar. It's not going anywhere yet, but it could if you move wrong. Her gaze flicked to the door, to the snow, to the angled floor. Yet, she echoed faintly, and there was a humorless edge to it that told Ethan she met fear with wit when she could. Is anyone coming? He listened, straining past the wind and metal to catch sirens or voices, and heard only the distant, uncertain call of a horn somewhere far down the line. They will, he said, hoping the confidence in his tone would hold. He checked his watch again, the habit now an irritation, and the second hand ticked with an accusation he could not argue away. As if summoned by the thought, his phone buzzed in his pocket, a vibration that felt obscenely loud in the tight space. Once, then again. Sarah flinched at the sound, eyes darting, and Ethan felt a rush of irritation at the intrusion, at the way the outside world demanded obedience on its schedule even now. He turned his body slightly, blocking the phone from her view, and reached down to adjust Shadow's position, keeping the dog's weight steady. Focus on him, he told Sarah gently. Breathe with him. Shadow obliged with a slow, exaggerated sigh, the kind that seemed to pull the room into his chest and release it calmer. The phone buzzed again, insistent, and Ethan knew without looking who it was, the call he had to answer to remain compliant, the call that would place him, triangulate him, measure him against rules written for tidy lives. He thought of the brake rigging, the tool marks, the certainty that this accident wore human fingerprints. He thought of Sarah's pale face and the way her breath had steadied under Shadow's weight. He thought of the fence, the sunlight, the easy path back to a quiet kitchen and a ringing phone. The oath he had sworn long ago rose unbidden, not as a speech, but as a muscle memory, the way his body moved before his mind could second-guess it. Sarah's eyes followed his gaze as it drifted to his pocket. You should answer, she said, misreading the tension for courtesy. If someone's calling you... The boxcar groaned again, louder, a warning that the argument between steel and gravity was ongoing and not inclined to wait for paperwork. Ethan pulled the phone out, the screen lighting the interior with a pale glow that reflected off snow and metal, off Sarah's anxious eyes. The caller ID confirmed what he already knew, and for a suspended second the world narrowed to the rectangle of glass in his hand. He imagined the voice on the other end, crisp and procedural, imagined the questions, the notation, the consequences stacking neatly into a future that did not include this moment. He also imagined the silence if he declined, the patrol car that would come later, the explanation that would sound like a lie because truth often did when it wore mud on its boots. Shadow shifted, sensing the change, and pressed more firmly into Sarah, anchoring her as her breath wavered again. Ethan's thumb hovered over the screen, snowflakes melting on his knuckles, and he felt the weight of two systems pulling at him, the rules that kept order and the oath that kept meaning. Ethan, Sarah whispered, the way people say a name when they are afraid to ask for help outright. He met her gaze and made his choice without drama, without anger, without ceremony. He pressed the button and held it, feeling the vibration die beneath his thumb as the screen dimmed and then went black, a dark mirror that reflected bright snow and his own face back at him. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the boxcar breathed. The phone went silent, and with it, the last easy path out closed, leaving only the work in front of him and the promise he had just kept at a cost he could not yet measure. Daylight leaked into the boxcar through the torn door and a spiderweb of fractured seams, turning the swirling snow into a bright, drifting veil that looked almost gentle until it brushed skin and burned like needles. Inside, the air was metallic and stale, every breath tasting of cold iron and old grease, and the floor slanted just enough to keep reminding the body that gravity was still arguing with the train. Sarah Miller lay half-supported by Shadow's broad chest, her posture stiff with shock, her breath catching and releasing in uneven rhythms that gradually began to slow. She was a tall, slender woman, built more from endurance than softness, with long limbs that now seemed folded too tightly for the space. Her hair, dark brown and straight, had once been pulled back with care, the kind of low, practical style chosen by someone who valued efficiency over display. But now it had slipped loose and clung to her temples in damp strands. Her skin was pale in the winter light, drained by cold and fear, with a faint flush beginning to return where Shadow's warmth pressed against her. When she tried to speak, her words stuttered, not from nerves, Ethan realized, but from the way cold had slowed the muscles of her jaw and tongue, turning speech into a series of small battles. She had to win one syllable at a time. I'm fine, she said, attempting steadiness and failing, her voice rough, the consonants brittle. The effort alone made her shoulders tremble. Ethan watched closely, cataloging signs the way he had been trained to do, noting the way her eyes stayed sharp even as her body lagged behind, the way she fought to sit upright not out of panic now but out of habit, as if control were something she refused to surrender even to circumstance. Shadow adjusted without prompting, shifting his weight so his chest rested more securely against her sternum, his thick fur trapping warmth, his breathing slow and deliberate. He was 7 years old, past the reckless exuberance of youth, his movements economical, his intelligence visible in the calm patience of his eyes. He had done this before, Ethan knew. Not with Sarah, not here, but with Ethan himself on nights when memory clawed too hard and the present thinned. The dog's presence was not comfort in the sentimental sense. It was regulation, a physical reminder that a body could be guided back into rhythm if it had something steady to follow. Sarah noticed it too. Her breathing began to sync with Shadow's, the panic in her gaze loosening its grip. "Your dog," she murmured, one gloved hand lifting with effort to rest against Shadow's shoulder, fingers sinking into the dense fur. "He knows what he's doing." "He does," Ethan said. "Just keep breathing with him." She nodded, a small, precise movement that cost her more than she wanted to admit. "Thank you," she added after a pause, the words clipped, as if gratitude were something she usually delivered in writing rather than aloud. Ethan gave a brief nod, not trusting himself to respond with anything softer than fact. He shifted his stance and listened again to the train. The groaning had taken on a different quality, less rhythmic now, more erratic, as the wind pushed harder against the exposed side of the boxcar. Outside, snow thickened, flakes colliding and melting against steel, and the light dimmed just a fraction, enough to sharpen the shadows. Ethan glanced toward the curve ahead, where the derailed cars leaned like a broken spine, and did the math he did not want to do. If the temperature dropped further, if the wind gusted at the wrong angle, the compromised cars could slide, couplers snapping, momentum dragging the rear section closer to the embankment. He checked the crates bracing Sarah's side and tested one with a careful shove. It shifted more easily than he liked. "We don't have much time," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. Sarah caught the tone anyway. "What do you mean?" she asked, forcing her voice to steadiness. Ethan met her eyes, weighing how much truth helped and how much frightened. "This section could move," he said. "If the weather turns worse, it won't wait for help to arrive." She absorbed that without drama, the way someone used to bad news filed information before reacting. "Then we should move me," she said, starting to brace her hands against the floor. The boxcar answered with a sharp creak, metal protesting. Ethan raised a hand. "Not yet, we need to be smart." She exhaled through her nose, a controlled release that suggested frustration more than fear. "I'm not good at waiting," she said. There was no complaint in it, only statement. Ethan believed her. He had the sense that Sarah Miller lived in a world where waiting was a tool she used on others, not something she endured herself. "Neither am I," he replied, surprising himself with the honesty. Outside, a new sound threaded through the wind, distant, rising, unmistakable. Sirens. Not close yet, but coming, their wail muted by snow and distance. Sarah's head turned toward the sound, relief and tension mixing in her expression. "They're coming?" she said. "Good." Ethan felt the word snag in his chest. Coming meant questions. Coming meant procedures. Coming meant he would soon be standing in a place where his choices were no longer his alone. He checked his watch again, out of reflex, though he already knew what it would tell him. The minute hand had passed the point of no return. He had turned off his phone. There would be a record of that, even if the reason never made it into any report that mattered. He looked at Sarah and saw intelligence flicker behind her fatigue, saw the way she tracked his glance to his wrist, the uniform, the boots, dusted white. "You're military," she said, not as a guess but as recognition. "Former," Ethan corrected. She nodded once, accepting the nuance. You move like it, she added, then winced as another gust rocked the car. Shadow leaned harder into her, a low sound vibrating in his chest that steadied her again. What were you doing on a freight train? Ethan asked gently, choosing curiosity over suspicion. Sarah hesitated, the first real pause he'd seen in her, and for a moment her composure slipped enough to reveal fatigue etched deeper than the cold. I was on my way to handle something important, she said at last. Something that couldn't wait. She met his gaze, direct and unflinching despite the circumstances. That's all I can say. Ethan accepted that too. He had learned long ago that people who mattered often carried silence the way others carried wallets. The sirens grew louder, joined now by the deeper horn of a rail vehicle, the sound echoing off the cut walls of snow and earth. Shadow's ears twitched, then settled, his attention never leaving Sarah. Ethan moved to the door and scanned the approach, spotting flashing lights through the curtain of snow, blue and red diffused into pastel blurs by the storm. He felt a tightening in his shoulders, the familiar prelude to restraint. They're close, he said. When they get here, they'll want statements. Sarah's mouth tightened. Of course they will. He turned back to her. I need you to understand something, he said, voice low. Once they see me here, once I step out with you, I won't be able to explain things the way you might expect. She studied him then. Really studied him, her eyes sharp despite exhaustion. Because you broke a rule, she said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, it was an observation. Ethan nodded. Because I chose to. Another gust hit, harder this time, and the boxcar lurched, crates scraping loudly. Sarah gasped, instinctively clutching Shadow, and the dog responded by planting himself more firmly, a living brace. Ethan felt the floor tilt a hair more beneath his boots. He imagined the report that would be written later, the tidy language that would flatten this moment into bullet points. He imagined the cuffs, the questions, the kennel truck waiting for Shadow if things went badly. The sirens were close now, voices shouting faintly through the wind. There would be no slipping away unnoticed. He looked at Sarah and understood with sudden clarity that when he left this boxcar, when he stepped back into the open snow and raised his hands or answered his name, he would be crossing another line, one that could not be uncrossed. When we go, he said, making the decision aloud, I'll help you first. Then I'll deal with whatever comes. Sarah swallowed, her throat working around the cold. You're going to get arrested, she said. It was not a question. Ethan allowed himself a thin, humorless smile. Probably, he said. The word landed between them, heavy and honest. The lights outside flared brighter as vehicles pulled up along the track, engines idling, radios crackling. Shadow lifted his head, alert but calm, as if bracing for a change in the environment he could sense but not see. Ethan reached down and rested a hand briefly on the dog's neck, feeling the steady strength there. Stay with her, he murmured. Shadow's tail thumped once, a quiet acknowledgement. The boxcar groaned again, louder now, and Ethan felt the urgency spike. He turned toward the door, squinting against the snow and lights, and understood with a clarity that surprised him how this would look from the outside. A man in military fatigues emerging from a wreck, a woman injured behind him, a dog at her side. No matter the truth, no matter the sabotage he had seen, the story would not belong to him anymore. He would be processed, categorized, judged. The sirens cut abruptly as engines shut off, boots crunching on snow, voices calling out commands. Ethan took a breath that tasted like iron and winter and inevitability. He met Sarah's eyes one last time before stepping toward the light, and in that moment he knew with absolute certainty that the cost of what he had done was about to be collected. The wind rose as if offended by the delay, driving snow sideways through the torn doorway and forcing daylight into sharp, flashing shards. Ethan worked fast, because speed now meant mercy. He fashioned the rescue line from what the boxcar offered and what his pockets remembered, a length of webbing torn from a cargo strap, a steel hook scavenged from a crate corner, knots tied by muscle memory rather than thought. He tested the line with a hard pull, felt it bite, then threaded it around a solid anchor point that would hold even if the car shifted another inch toward the embankment. We're going to move you, he told Sarah, keeping his voice steady and his words simple. She nodded, jaw set, the stubborn resolve of someone who refused to be carried by fear. Shadow stayed pressed to her until the last second, then rose and stepped aside at Ethan's signal, his amber eyes never leaving her face. When Ethan slid the line beneath her arms and tightened it across her back, Sarah sucked in a breath and hissed through her teeth, pain flashing bright and immediate. She did not cry out. She swallowed it and nodded again, permission granted. The boxcar groaned as if protesting the decision, metal answering metal, and Ethan felt the deck tilt another fraction beneath his boots. "Now," he said, and pulled. The line took her weight, the webbing cutting into his gloves, and for a terrifying second gravity argued back. Then the anchor held. Ethan braced, shifting his stance, and guided Sarah toward the doorway inch by careful inch. Snow lashed her face as she crossed the threshold, daylight bleaching her features until they looked almost unreal. But the line did its work, and Shadow was there again, shoulder under her elbow, a living counterbalance. Together they eased her down to the packed snow beside the track, where Ethan wrapped her in his jacket and knelt to secure the line for the next step. Voices cut through the wind. Commands, questions, the clipped urgency of people trained to take over. Lights flared brighter as rail workers and deputies closed in, their silhouettes sharp against the white. Ethan raised a hand, palm out, and shouted over the gusts, directing them toward Sarah without giving them anything else to grab. "She's hypothermic," he called. "Head injury, stable but cold." A paramedic moved in, a woman with short blonde hair plastered to her forehead beneath a knit cap, eyes quick and professional, and she took over without ceremony, wrapping Sarah in thermal blankets, asking questions. Sarah answered in broken phrases. Ethan stepped back as soon as hands replaced his, as soon as responsibility shifted from oath to protocol. He felt the release like a sudden drop in temperature. A deputy approached, tall and broad-shouldered, with a trimmed beard frosted white and eyes that measured people as if they were tools to be catalogued. "Sir," the deputy said, voice neutral. "Name?" Ethan shook his head once, a small movement swallowed by snow. "She needs care," he replied, and took another step back, away from the circle of light. The deputy frowned, opened his mouth, and Ethan turned and walked, boots crunching, heart hammering, the easy confidence of the moment already dissolving into something colder. He didn't run. Running drew lines. He moved into the white space beyond the lights, following the cut of the land and the fence he had crossed earlier, Shadow at his heel, silent as the snow itself. Behind him, radios crackled and voices rose, confusion blooming where clarity had been expected. By the time someone thought to follow, the wind had already erased his tracks. The walk home was longer than it should have been, the cold sharper now that the adrenaline had burned off. Ethan's breath rasped in his chest, each inhale a reminder of the choice he'd made and the cost it carried. Shadow stayed close, occasionally brushing Ethan's leg with his shoulder, a quiet check-in that required no words. When the cabin finally appeared, a dark shape against a white field, relief came and went in the same breath. Ethan went inside, peeled off wet layers, checked the stove, checked the locks, and looked at the phone on the wall without touching it. The call had come and gone. He could feel that absence like a bruise. He fed Shadow, filled the kettle, sat at the small table, and waited for the knock that did not come that night. Sleep took him in fragments, shallow and tense. Morning arrived bright and pitiless. The knock came with it. 2 deputies stood on his porch, snow clinging to their coats. One was the bearded man from the tracks, the other younger, clean-shaven, eyes uncertain. Ethan answered calmly, hands visible. He listened as they read from paper, the words neat and devastating. Failure to comply, obstruction, leaving the scene. When they turned to cuff him, Shadow moved forward on instinct, a low sound building in his chest. "Stay," Ethan said sharply, and Shadow froze, confusion flickering across his face before training won. The leash went to another hand. The cabin felt smaller as they led Ethan out into the light. At the station, the room was bright and cold and smelled of disinfectant. Paperwork replaced conversation. Ethan answered what he could, refused what he must, watched as Shadow was led away by a handler who smelled of uncertainty. "Temporary holding," someone said, as if the word temporary could soften the blow. The cell was lit too brightly, the kind of light designed to discourage thought and succeed at it. Ethan sat on the bench, elbows on knees, hands clasped, and listened to the building hum. Somewhere down the hall, a door slammed. Somewhere farther, a dog howled. The sound rose and fell, familiar and terrible, and Ethan closed his eyes as it threaded through him, carrying the weight of snow and steel and choice. Snow polished Spokane into something austere and blinding, the courthouse steps reflecting daylight so sharply it felt like the city itself had decided to testify. Inside, the air was warmer but no less severe, the kind of warmth that did not forgive mistakes, only preserved them long enough to be catalogued. Ethan Walker stood at the defense table in his U.S. Navy working uniform, pressed and orderly, the green camouflage incongruous, beneath the fluorescent lights and the seal of the state. The uniform did not soften him. It sharpened him, emphasizing the straight-backed posture, the squared shoulders, the controlled stillness of a man trained to be observed without flinching. His face was clean-shaven now, jaw angular and tense, dark eyes steady as if fixed on a distant horizon rather than the rows of benches in the murmuring gallery. Shadow lay at his heel, permitted by the court as a service dog, his vest clean and bright against the marble floor, amber eyes half-lidded yet alert, the slow rise and fall of his chest the only sign of ease in a room built for judgment. The bailiff called the room to order, a middle-aged man with thinning hair and a practiced baritone, and people rose as one, coats rustling like restrained wings. When the judge entered, the sound of movement faded into a hush that felt heavier than silence. Judge Sarah Miller took the bench with an economy of motion that suggested she disliked ceremony as much as she respected structure. She wore black robes that softened nothing, her posture upright, her expression composed to the point of austerity. Up close, she looked exactly as Ethan remembered from the boxcar, and yet not at all. Tall and lean, hair drawn back into a tight knot that revealed the clean lines of her face. Skin pale under courtroom lights with a faint bruise at the hairline where winter had left its mark. Her eyes, dark and incisive, scanned the docket with professional distance, and when they lifted to survey the room, they passed over Ethan without recognition, registering only another defendant, another uniformed body occupying space where a story would soon be told about him rather than by him. Ethan felt something settle in his chest. Not disappointment, not relief, but the cold acknowledgement that whatever bond existed in crisis did not survive daylight and robes. The prosecutor rose, a man named Andrew Holt, whose tailored suit and precise diction suggested a career built on winning arguments rather than understanding people. He was in his early 40s, tall and slender, hair perfectly combed, smile deployed sparingly and only when it served. His voice carried easily, crisp as paper cuts, and as he laid out the charges, obstruction, evasion, failure to comply, each word landed with practiced inevitability. He spoke of timelines and procedures, of an unnamed suspect leaving a scene, of a defendant who believed himself above rules designed to keep order. The evidence, on paper, was neat. A missed check-in, a departure without identification, a pattern of non-compliance painted in ink. Ethan listened without moving, hands resting lightly on the table, absorbing the narrative built to contain him. Shadow remained still, head on pause, ears angled toward the bench rather than the gallery, sensing where attention would turn next. The defense attorney, a public defender named Leo Finch, rose when it was his turn, and the contrast was immediate. Finch was younger, late 20s at most, thin to the point of fragility, his suit a size too large as if borrowed from a future he had not yet grown into. His hair fell into his eyes when he spoke, and he pushed it back with a nervous habit that betrayed more sincerity than polish. He argued context, necessity, the presence of an injured woman and a compromised train, the split-second decisions made under pressure. His words were earnest and imperfect, occasionally stumbling over legal phrasing, but they carried a quiet insistence that facts did not always tell the whole truth. Judge Miller listened without interruption, her face unreadable, fingers steepled lightly as if holding the shape of the law between them. When Finch finished, she leaned forward slightly, the movement controlled and deliberate. "Walker," she said, her voice even and cool, "you chose to leave the scene without identifying yourself." It was not a question. Ethan met her gaze and nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." "You chose not to answer a required check-in call." Again, not a question. "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom seemed to inhale as one. "You understand," she continued, "that these requirements exist to prevent precisely this kind of uncertainty." Ethan's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "I understand the requirements." A pause. "Do you believe they do not apply to you?" The question carried a hook. Ethan felt it catch. He thought of snow blowing through steel, of a woman's breath stuttering back to life under a dog's steady weight, of the moment when compliance would have been easier than courage. He chose his words carefully, aware that sincerity without strategy could still be fatal. "No, Your Honor," he said. "I believe they apply. I also believe there are moments when following them would cause harm." A murmur rippled through the gallery and was stilled by the bailiff's glance. Judge Miller's eyes sharpened. "Harm," she repeated. "And who decides when harm outweighs order, Mr. Walker?" Ethan did not look at Shadow then, though the dog shifted subtly, sensing the rise in tension. "I did," Ethan said. "In that moment." The words hung there, plain and damning in their simplicity. Judge Miller leaned back, her expression cooling further. "The court cannot function on individual exception," she said. "If every defendant weighed personal judgment against lawful instruction, there would be no system to enforce." She turned to the prosecutor. "The evidence before me shows a pattern of disregard for court-ordered compliance." Holt nodded, satisfied. Finch started to rise again, a protest forming, but Judge Miller raised a hand, halting him without looking. "I'm not questioning the presence of an injured party," she said, her voice firm. "I'm addressing conduct. Mr. Walker's conduct demonstrates an unwillingness to be governed." Ethan felt the words land like stones. Shadow lifted his head then, eyes opening fully, a low sound barely audible in his throat before he stilled himself, responding to Ethan's subtle command. Judge Miller glanced down at the dog, a flicker of irritation crossing her features, then back to Ethan. "This court will not be lenient with disobedience dressed as heroism," she said. "Rules are not suggestions." She paused, letting the statement take root. "At this juncture, the court is not inclined to excuse violations based on self-assessed necessity." Finch spoke then, voice thin but urgent. "Your Honor, we ask for consideration of circumstances." "Denied," Judge Miller said crisply. "The court will proceed on the record as it stands." She straightened, the robe settling around her like armor. "Mr. Walker, understand this clearly. This court will not tolerate non-compliance." The gavel did not fall, but the words struck just as hard. Ethan absorbed them without visible reaction, the discipline of stillness carrying him through. He felt the paradox sharpen. The woman whose life he had helped preserve now framed him as a threat to order. He did not blame her. He recognized the mechanism. Systems survived by resisting exceptions. Shadow lay back down, chin on paws, the picture of obedience in a room that prized it. Outside, snow continued to fall, bright and indifferent, while inside the law drew its lines with a steady hand. The courtroom lights burned with an unforgiving steadiness, bleaching color from faces and turning breath into something measured and brittle. Sound traveled oddly there, magnified by wood and stone, every shuffle of paper and cleared throat landing with the weight of intent. Judge Sarah Miller sat rigid at the bench, her posture immaculate, hands folded with care, yet the composure cost her more than she allowed to show. The winter bruise at her hairline throbbed beneath the polished surface of authority, a deep pressure that had followed her since the derailment and now chose this moment to bloom. It began as a pulse behind her left eye, sharp and insistent, then widened into a band of pain that squeezed her temples and made the room tilt just enough to be dangerous. She didn't flinch. She had built a career on not flinching, but her breath shortened, and the light took on a harsh edge that scraped at her nerves. She pressed 2 fingers briefly against her temple and lowered them again, refusing the mercy of pause. Below her, Ethan Walker stood as he had stood before, straight, contained, the lines of his face set into a calm that did not ask for sympathy. Shadow lay at his heel, a black and tan island of stillness amid the tension, his ears half-cocked toward the bench, his eyes alert in a way that suggested he was listening not to words but to something deeper, chemical and immediate. As the prosecutor resumed, his voice slid over Sarah like cold water. He spoke of compliance and deterrence, of order maintained by consequence. The words blurred at the edges as the pain sharpened, and Sarah found herself fighting the memory that crept in uninvited. A slanted floor of steel, snow stinging her face, the metallic scream that had torn daylight open. She blinked hard, willing the present back into focus. Then the pressure spiked, a white-hot lance that made her inhale sharply despite herself. It was enough. Shadow rose. The movement was subtle but unmistakable, a shift of mass and purpose that drew eyes without sound. The bailiff tensed, hand drifting toward his belt, but the dog did not advance with challenge or haste. He moved with the same deliberate calm he had shown in the boxcar, crossing the narrow space between defense table and bench, as if the courtroom were merely another environment that needed regulation. Sarah watched him approach through the haze, a large German shepherd with intelligent amber eyes and a coat dulled by winter light, his age evident in the economy of his stride rather than any loss of strength. He stopped at the edge of the bench, placed his forepaws gently on the wood, and rested his head on the lip, the weight immediate and grounding. The effect was visceral. A low, resonant sigh rolled out of his chest, a sound Sarah felt more than heard, vibrating through the bench and into her forearms. The room froze. The pain did not vanish, but it receded enough to make space for something else. Warmth, pressure, rhythm. Her breath caught and then slowed, matching the dog's. The courtroom dissolved around her. The smell of polish and paper gave way to iron and snow. She was back in the boxcar, her chest locked with panic, the cold trying to erase sensation. She remembered the dog then too, this dog, his head heavy on her sternum, the steady insistence of his breathing dragging her back from the edge. She remembered the man's voice, low and sure, cutting through the metallic groan. She remembered the phone vibrating somewhere close, a harsh insistence that did not belong in a place where life was slipping away. And she remembered the moment the vibration stopped. The memory snapped into focus with the clarity of truth. Her eyes lifted from the dog to the defendant. Ethan stood exactly as she remembered him, though the uniform was different and the setting transformed. The same squared jaw, the same controlled stillness, the same refusal to panic. She saw, with a shock that felt like cold water to the face, the man who had turned off his phone, the man who had chosen to be unreachable so she could keep breathing. Sarah's hand moved without permission and came to rest on Shadow's head, fingers sinking into thick fur. The dog did not move. The bailiff opened his mouth to object and closed it again. When Sarah lifted her gaze, authority reasserted not through volume but certainty. "It's all right," she said quietly. The prosecutor hesitated, uncertain, his confidence faltering in the face of something he could not categorize. Sarah drew a slow breath, the pain now a distant echo, and straightened. "Mr. Holt," she said, her voice steadier than it had been moments before. "We will pause." "Your Honor, we will pause," she repeated, and the room obeyed. She looked down at Ethan, really looked this time, and spoke with a deliberation that carried weight. "Mr. Walker, you stated you chose to act when you did. I want the record expanded." She turned to the clerk. "Pull the rail data from the derailment, brake telemetry, event recorder logs, GPS timestamps. I want the maintenance records as well." A murmur rippled through the gallery, stilled by her raised hand. "Now." The clerk complied, fingers flying. Screens flickered to life, projecting data that replaced narrative with measurement. Sarah leaned forward, eyes scanning columns and graphs, the language of machines something she trusted. The prosecutor shifted, unease creeping into his posture. "Your Honor," he began, "this is highly irregular." Sarah did not look at him. "Truth is not irregular," she said. "Neglecting it is." The data told its story without drama. Brake application anomalies, a command issued where none should have been, tool marks matching a rushed intervention rather than failure, GPS timestamps that placed the train's rear cars in a pattern inconsistent with weather alone. Sarah felt the pieces align, the way they had not aligned when framed by accusation. She looked back to Ethan. "You said the evidence showed sabotage," she said. "On what basis?" Ethan spoke plainly, naming the components, the marks, the behavior of steel under forced error. His tone was not defensive, it was instructional. Sarah nodded once, the motion small but decisive. She turned to the prosecutor. "The court will not proceed on assumptions. The narrative presented thus far omits material facts." She gestured to the screen. "These records corroborate Mr. Walker's account. They indicate interference prior to the derailment." Silence took the room, heavy and complete. The prosecutor's mouth opened and closed. The defense attorney stared, hope breaking across his features like dawn. Sarah rested her hand again on Shadow's head, the dog's warmth anchoring her as she spoke the words that shifted the ground beneath them all. "This hearing will change course," she said, and met Ethan's eyes without flinching. Winter loosened its grip on Spokane without ceremony, as if the city itself were reluctant to admit surrender. The snow still fell, but now it drifted instead of attacked, catching daylight rather than devouring it. Streets gleamed softly, the white no longer blinding, only reflective, and the air, still cold, carried the faint promise of thaw beneath its sharpness. In that gentler light, truth moved faster than it ever had during the storm. The evidence Sarah ordered reopened did not whisper. It spoke plainly. Rail telemetry confirmed deliberate interference. Brake logs showed a sequence no accident could explain. GPS data traced movements that contradicted official reports, and maintenance records revealed signatures forged by hands far more careless than Ethan Walker's disciplined precision. Within days, the narrative collapsed. The man responsible, a mid-level rail contractor named Mark Halverson, was taken into custody. He was a narrow-shouldered man in his late 40s, thinning hair plastered to his scalp, eyes perpetually darting as if seeking exits that no longer existed. Greed had hollowed him out. Shortcuts and kickbacks had eroded his judgment long before steel met snow. When confronted with the data, he folded quickly, confession tumbling out of him with more relief than remorse. The charges against Ethan dissolved just as quickly. One by one, they were dismissed, struck from the record with the clean efficiency of a system correcting itself. Late, but not too late. On the morning it became official, Ethan stood outside the courthouse in his U.S. Navy working uniform, hands clasped behind his back out of habit rather than necessity. The uniform still fit him the same way it always had, structured, uncompromising, honest. He wore it not for ceremony, but because it reminded him who he was when the world tried to reduce him to a case number. Shadow sat at his side, posture relaxed for the first time in weeks, tail sweeping slow arcs against the packed snow. The German Shepherd had changed subtly since the storm. He was still powerful, still alert, but the constant edge, the vigilance sharpened by fear of separation, had softened. His coat gleamed in the pale winter sun, black and tanned fur catching silver highlights where snow dusted his back. At 7 years old, he carried himself with the calm confidence of a veteran, scars unseen but earned, eyes steady and intelligent. A small crowd gathered on the courthouse steps. A few reporters, a rail official stiff with embarrassment, 2 deputies who now avoided Ethan's gaze out of awkward respect. When the clerk stepped outside to read the final dismissal aloud, the words sounded almost anticlimactic, as if justice were embarrassed by how long it had taken to arrive. Ethan didn't smile. He closed his eyes briefly, exhaled, and felt the weight lift. Not all at once, but enough to breathe freely again. Shadow leaned into his leg, pressing his shoulder there, a familiar grounding gesture that needed no command. Later that afternoon, in a modest conference room warmed by sunlight reflecting off the snow, a small ceremony took place. It was not grand. No flags, no speeches heavy with metaphor. Just a city official reading a citation, a photographer adjusting a lens, and a veterinarian pinning a new patch onto Shadow's service vest. The citation named the dog's actions clearly: life-saving intervention, emotional stabilization under extreme conditions, unwavering obedience. Shadow accepted the attention with mild confusion, ears flicking at applause, eyes searching only for Ethan. When Ethan knelt to straighten the vest, his hands trembled, not from cold, but from something that felt dangerously like relief. Then Sarah Miller entered the room quietly, without announcement. She no longer wore her robes. Instead, she stood in a simple winter coat the color of wet stone, scarf loose around her neck, dark hair falling naturally to her shoulders. Without the bench between them, she seemed taller somehow, lean and composed, but unmistakably human. Her skin still carried the faint pallor of recovery, and when she moved, there was a carefulness to her steps, as if she were still learning the limits of her body after betrayal by metal and ice. The room stilled when she spoke. "Walker," she said, voice steady but unguarded. Ethan stood, instinct pulling him upright, but she raised a hand. "Not as a judge," she continued. "Not today." She crossed the room and stopped a respectful distance away, eyes dropping briefly to Shadow, who watched her with calm recognition, tail giving a single, deliberate wag. Sarah swallowed, then met Ethan's gaze. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not for the ruling, that was corrected by evidence, but for the certainty with which I judged you before I understood." Her voice tightened, just enough to reveal the cost of the admission. "In the courtroom, I spoke of rules. On the train, you acted on something older than rules. I didn't see that at first." Ethan listened without interruption. He had learned long ago that apologies were not something to interrupt or rush. They were things to receive with the respect they demanded. "You don't owe me anything," he said finally. "You did your job." Sarah shook her head once. "No," she replied softly. "I survived because you chose to break away from your own protection. Because you turned off a phone when answering it would have saved you." She glanced down, breath catching for a fraction of a second. "I wanted to say thank you. Not from the bench, but as a person who was carried back from the edge." Shadow rose then and stepped forward, closing the distance she hesitated to cross. He pressed his head gently against her hip, the same grounding weight he had offered in steel and snow. Sarah knelt without thinking, gloved hands sinking into his thick fur, and for a moment her composure slipped. Ethan looked away, granting her privacy, watching snow drift past the window in slow, patient spirals. They stood together afterward in the fading afternoon, three figures outlined against winter light. A man in uniform, a dog at his side, a woman no longer defined solely by authority or survival. Outside, snow continued to fall, lighter now, kinder, settling without urgency, as if content to rest where it landed. There were no speeches, no proclamations. Just the quiet understanding that some acts of courage were never meant to be loud, and that justice, when it arrived at last, did so not with thunder but with clarity. Sometimes miracles don't arrive with thunder or blinding light. They come quietly. In the moment a person chooses compassion over comfort, truth over safety, love over fear. God weaves invisible threads through our lives, a meeting that seems accidental, a decision made in the middle of a storm, a life spared because someone refused to walk away. Justice may arrive late, but God never does. In our everyday lives, we face the same choices in smaller ways. Stopping to help a stranger, speaking kindness when silence is easier, standing for what is right when no one is watching. There may be no applause, no reward, but every act of goodness is a seed God plants in this world, and in time, those seeds grow. If this story touched your heart, please share it so hope can reach others. Leave a comment to tell us about a moment when you witnessed a miracle, and subscribe to the channel to continue this journey with us. May God bless you and your loved ones, protect you through every storm, guide your steps in the dark, and give you the strength to always choose what is right, even when it costs you something.